The winter wind cut through the barracks at Fort Omaha like a blade, rattling the windows and sending papers scattering across Staff Sergeant Michael Torres' desk. Outside, the Nebraska sky hung heavy with the promise of snow, casting everything in shades of gray that matched his mood. It was February 1942, and America had been at war for just 2 months, but already the weight of it pressed down on everyone like a lead blanket. Torres rubbed his tired eyes and returned his attention to the stack of recruitment photographs before him. Hundreds of young faces stared back, eager and determined, ready to serve their country. His job was to match these photos with personnel files, ensuring every soldier's documentation was complete before deployment. It was tedious work, but necessary in the chaos of rapid mobilization. He picked up another photograph, glancing at it with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had processed thousands of similar images. Then he stopped. His blood turned to ice water in his veins. The face looking back at him was unmistakable. Square jaw, dark hair slicked back in regulation style, a small scar above the left eyebrow. Those same pale blue eyes that had stared up at him from a pine coffin 3 years ago. "Private James Morrison," Torres whispered, reading the name typed on the back of the photograph. His hands began to shake. He remembered that October day in 1939 with crystal clarity, the training accident at the firing range. Morrison's body crumpled in the mud, a single bullet wound to the chest from a rifle malfunction. Torres had been there when they loaded him onto the stretcher, had watched the medic shake his head grimly. He had helped carry the coffin at the funeral, felt its weight on his shoulder as they marched through Prospect Hill Cemetery. Yet here was Morrison's face, photographed just weeks ago according to the processing date stamped on the back. The same man, unchanged by time, wearing a crisp new uniform and looking directly into the camera with those haunting blue eyes. Torres's chair scraped against the floor as he stood abruptly, his heart hammering against his ribs. Other soldiers in the administrative office looked up from their work, but Torres barely noticed them. He needed air, needed to think, needed to make sense of what couldn't possibly make sense. Outside, the February wind bit at his face as he walked quickly across the base grounds. His breath came in white puffs that dissipated in the gray afternoon light. Snow had begun to fall, light flakes that melted the moment they touched the ground. In the distance, he could hear the rhythmic cadence of soldiers drilling, their voices carrying across the flat Nebraska landscape. Torres found himself walking toward the main gate without conscious thought, the photograph clutched in his trembling hand. He had to see old Pete. Pete Kowalski had been the gravedigger at Prospect Hill Cemetery for over 30 years, and Torres remembered him well from Morrison's funeral. If anyone could confirm what Torres knew to be true, it would be Pete. The cemetery lay just outside the city proper, its iron gates crowned with frost-covered angels that seemed to watch his approach with stone eyes. Torres had always found cemeteries peaceful, but today, Prospect Hill felt different. There was something in the air, a tension that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Even the crows that usually roosted in the oak trees were silent. He found Pete in the maintenance shed, sharpening a spade with methodical strokes. The old man looked up as Torres approached, his weathered face creasing into a smile that quickly faded when he saw the sergeant's expression. "Michael Torres," Pete said, setting down his tools. "Haven't seen you since that boy's funeral. Morrison, wasn't it?" "That's what I need to talk to you about, Pete," Torres said, his voice strained. "James Morrison. You buried him in October of 1939, right? You remember that day?" Pete's eyes narrowed and something flickered across his face that might have been fear. "Course I remember. Not many soldiers get buried here. Why you asking?" Torres held out the photograph with a hand that wouldn't stop shaking, because this was taken 3 weeks ago at Fort Omaha. Pete took the photograph and studied it for a long moment. His face went ashen, and he sank down onto an old wooden crate. "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph," he whispered. "That's him. That's the boy I put in the ground 3 years ago." The snow was falling heavier now, blanketing the cemetery in pristine white. In the gathering dusk, the headstones looked like teeth jutting from the earth's mouth. Pete's hands trembled as he handed the photograph back to Torres. The old gravedigger's face had taken on the color of the tombstones surrounding them, and his usually steady voice wavered like a candle flame in the wind. "I need to show you something," Pete said, struggling to his feet. "Something I should have reported years ago, but who would have believed an old Polish gravedigger?" Torres followed him deeper into the cemetery, their footsteps muffled by the accumulating snow. The wind had picked up, howling between the monuments and sending skeletal tree branches scraping against each other like fingernails on a chalkboard. In the fading light, the cemetery took on an otherworldly quality, shadows stretching long and dark between the rows of graves. They stopped at a modest headstone near the back of the cemetery. The inscription read, "James Morrison, Private U.S. Army, 1918-1939, faithful unto death." Even in the dim twilight, Torres could see that the ground around the grave was different from the surrounding plots. While the rest of the cemetery was covered in a neat blanket of snow, this particular spot seemed to repel it, leaving patches of dark, muddy earth visible. "Been like this since the day after we buried him," Pete said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Snow won't stick, grass won't grow proper, and that's not the strangest part." Torres knelt beside the grave, running his fingers over the unsettled earth. It felt warm to the touch, which should have been impossible in the February cold. A chill ran down his spine that had nothing to do with the weather. "What else?" Torres asked, though part of him didn't want to know the answer. Pete glanced around nervously, as if checking to make sure they were alone. "3 times now, I've found this grave dug up from the inside. Not like someone came with shovels, mind you. Like something clawed its way out from below. First time was about 6 months after the funeral. Came to work one morning and found dirt scattered everywhere, the coffin lid splintered. Did you check inside?" "That's just it," Pete said, wrapping his coat tighter around himself. "The coffin was empty. Not a trace of the body, not even the uniform we buried him in. Reported it to the police, but they figured it was grave robbers. Told me to fill it back in and keep quiet about it." Torres stood up, brushing the strange warm dirt from his hands. "But it happened again?" "Twice more. Same thing each time. Grave torn open from the inside, coffin empty. Last time was just 2 weeks ago." Pete's voice dropped to a whisper. "But that ain't the worst of it, Sergeant. People have been seeing him." "Seeing who?" "Morrison. Walking through town late at night, always in uniform, always heading toward the river. Mrs. Henderson from Benson Street swears she saw him standing outside her window last Thursday night. Said he was just staring up at her house with those pale eyes of his, not moving, not blinking. When she got her husband to look, he was gone." Torres felt his skepticism warring with the evidence before his eyes. 3 years of military training had taught him to rely on facts and logic, but the warm earth beneath his feet and the photograph in his pocket defied all rational explanation. "There's more," Pete continued, his breath visible in white puffs. "Tommy Kowalski, my nephew, who works the night shift at the rail yard, he's seen him too. Says Morrison walks the tracks every night around midnight, heading east toward the Missouri. Tommy tried to call out to him once, thinking maybe he was sleepwalking or shell-shocked, but Morrison just turned and looked at him, and Tommy said it was like looking into the face of death itself." The wind picked up again, sending snow swirling around them like ghostly dancers. In the distance, a church bell tolled the hour, its deep bronze voice echoing across the frozen landscape. Torres pulled his coat collar up against the cold, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them from the shadows between the tombstones. "Pete, I need you to do something for me," Torres said. "I need you to help me dig up this grave. Tonight." The old man's eyes widened in horror. "Sergeant, I can't do that. It ain't right, disturbing the dead." "But that's just it, Pete. If what you're telling me is true, if people are seeing Morrison walking around town, then maybe he's not really dead. Maybe we buried someone else, or maybe—" Torres paused, struggling to voice the impossible thought. "Maybe death doesn't work the way we think it does." Pete stared at the grave for a long moment, then slowly nodded. "All right. But we wait until after midnight, when the patrol cars have finished their rounds. And if we find what I think we're going to find, we fill this hole back up and never speak of it again." The grandfather clock in Torres's quarters chimed midnight as he slipped out of the barracks and into the frigid Nebraska night. The snow had stopped, but the temperature had dropped even further, turning the accumulated powder into a crust that crunched under his boots. Above, a pale moon cast everything in silver light, making the landscape look like something from another world. He had spent the intervening hours poring over Morrison's military records, searching for any clue that might explain what was happening. The file was straightforward enough. James Morrison, age 21, enlisted from a small farm outside Lincoln. No next of kin listed, parents deceased, no siblings. An unremarkable soldier until that October day, when a faulty rifle had claimed his life during routine training exercises. But now, studying the file more carefully, Torres noticed inconsistencies he had missed before. The death certificate was signed by Dr. Franklin Hayes, the base physician, but Hayes had been transferred to Fort Benning 2 days before Morrison's supposed death. The funeral expenses were paid by an anonymous donor, unusual for a soldier with no family. Most disturbing of all, there were no witness statements from the training accident, despite the fact that an entire squad had been present. Torres made his way through the darkened streets of Omaha, his breath forming clouds in the Arctic air. The city felt different at this hour, as if it belonged to something other than the living. Street lamps cast pools of yellow light that seemed to push back against an encroaching darkness, and shadows moved in ways that made Torres question what he was seeing. He found Pete waiting by the cemetery gates, 2 shovels and a kerosene lantern in his gnarled hands. The old man's face was grim, etched with lines of worry and fear. "Still think we shouldn't be doing this," Pete muttered, as they made their way through the rows of headstones. "Some things are better left alone." "We need to know the truth," Torres replied, though his own conviction was wavering. Every instinct screamed at him to turn around and pretend he had never seen that photograph. Morrison's grave lay before them like an open wound in the earth. So even in the moonlight, Torres could see that the soil was darker here, and wisps of what looked like steam rose from the ground. Pete set the lantern down and handed Torres a shovel. "Lord forgive us," Pete whispered, and began to dig. The earth came away easily, too easily, as if it wanted to be disturbed. Within minutes they had uncovered the splintered remains of a wooden coffin lid. Torres's hands shook as he pried away the broken boards, fully expecting to find nothing but empty space. Instead, he found something far worse. The coffin contained a body, but it wasn't James Morrison. The corpse was that of an older man, perhaps in his 50s, wearing civilian clothes that had rotted away to mere threads. The flesh had decomposed to leather and bone, but the face was still recognizable. Torres had seen it before, in wanted posters around the base. "Jesus Christ," Pete breathed, leaning over Torres's shoulder. "That's Frank Kerner, that German spy they were hunting 2 years ago, the one who disappeared from the federal building." Torres stared at the corpse, his mind reeling. But how did he end up in Morrison's grave? And where is Morrison's body? Before Pete could answer, a sound cut through the night air that made both men freeze. It was the sound of footsteps crunching through snow, approaching from the direction of the cemetery entrance. Slow, measured steps that echoed with military precision. "Someone's coming," Pete whispered, grabbing for the lantern. Torres caught his wrist. "Leave it. We need to see who it is." The footsteps grew closer, and soon a figure emerged from between the tombstones. It was a soldier in full-dress uniform, walking with the rigid posture of a man on parade. The moonlight reflected off his polished buttons and the insignia on his collar. As he drew nearer, Torres could make out the pale features and dark hair. It was James Morrison. The dead soldier stopped at the edge of the open grave and looked down at them with those unnaturally blue eyes. His face was perfectly preserved, showing no signs of decay or injury, but there was something wrong with his expression. It was blank, emotionless, as if looking at them through glass. "So you shouldn't have come here," Morrison said, his voice carrying clearly in the cold air but seeming to come from a great distance. "Some secrets are meant to stay buried." Torres found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a croak. "Morrison? Is that really you?" The figure that claimed to be Morrison tilted its head slightly, studying Torres with those unsettling, pale eyes. "You remember me, Sergeant, from that day at the range. You were there when they said I died. But you did die. I saw your body. We buried you." Morrison's lips curved into something that might have been a smile but held no warmth. "Did you? Look again at what you found in my grave." Pete scrambled out of the hole, his face white with terror. We should go right now." But Torres couldn't move, transfixed by the impossible sight before him. "What are you? What happened to you?" "I am what I was made to be," Morrison replied. "A soldier who cannot rest, cannot die, cannot leave his post. There are others like me, Sergeant. Men who died for their country, but were not allowed to stay dead. We serve a different kind of duty now." The temperature around Morrison seemed to drop even further, and Torres could see his breath coming in rapid white puffs as fear and confusion battled in his chest. Pete had backed away several steps, clutching his shovel like a weapon, but his aged hands trembled so violently he could barely hold it. "What do you mean, others like you?" Torres managed to ask, though his voice sounded foreign to his own ears. Morrison moved closer to the edge of the grave, his boots making no sound on the frozen ground. When he spoke, his breath produced no visible vapor despite the frigid air. The program began in 1937. Project Eternal Sentry, they called it. The military needed soldiers who couldn't be killed, couldn't desert, couldn't question orders. Men who would serve beyond death. Torres felt his legs go weak. That's impossible. You're talking about science fiction. Am I? Morrison gestured toward the open coffin. You found the truth, Sergeant. Frank Kerner was a German agent, yes, but he was also something more. A scientist who had developed a serum that could reanimate dead tissue, control the deceased. The government captured him in 1939, forced him to recreate his work. But the death certificate, the funeral, all part of the cover story. I volunteered for the first trial. They told us we would be heroes, that we would serve our country in ways no soldier had ever served before. Morrison's voice carried a hollow note of regret. They didn't tell us what we would lose, what we would become. Pete had retreated further, now standing among a cluster of weathered headstones. This is madness. This is the devil's work. Morrison turned those pale eyes toward the gravedigger. Is it, or is it patriotism taken to its logical conclusion? A soldier who never tires, never questions, never dies. The perfect warrior. Torres climbed out of the grave, his mind struggling to process what he was hearing. If this is true, if the government is creating soldiers like you, then why are you telling me? Why aren't you following orders? For the first time, something resembling human emotion flickered across Morrison's features. Because the serum is flawed. We maintain our memories, our personalities for a time, but gradually we lose pieces of ourselves. The others, the ones who came before me, they're nothing more than walking corpses now, mindless automatons following their last orders. How many others? Dozens, hidden in cemeteries across the country, activated when needed, then returned to their graves when their missions are complete. But something has gone wrong with the recent batch. We're not responding to the control signals properly. We're remembering things we shouldn't remember. Torres thought about the photograph that had started this nightmare. Is that why you're appearing in recruitment pictures? Because the control is failing. Morrison nodded slowly. The photographers don't see us when they take the pictures. We only appear when the film is developed. It's as if our existence exists between life and death, visible only to certain processes, certain people. A new voice cut through the night air, harsh and commanding. That's enough, Morrison. 3 figures emerged from the shadows between the tombstones, all wearing military uniforms, but moving with the same unnatural stillness as Morrison. Their faces were gaunt, their eyes empty of anything resembling humanity. These were the others Morrison had mentioned, the failed experiments. Dr. Reinhardt wants to see you, one of them said in a voice like grinding stone. Both of you. Torres felt ice water flooding his veins. Reinhardt? I thought Kerner was the scientist. Kerner was the German, Morrison replied, his own voice taking on a note of resignation. Reinhardt is the American who perfected his work. And now that you've discovered the truth, Sergeant, you've become part of the program whether you want to or not. The undead soldiers began to move closer, their movements synchronized like a drill formation. Pete let out a strangled cry and ran toward the cemetery gates, but one of the creatures moved with impossible speed to block his path. No one leaves until Dr. Reinhardt decides what to do with them, the creature said, its voice devoid of any human warmth. Torres reached for the service pistol at his hip, but Morrison caught his wrist. Bullets won't stop them, Sergeant, and running will only make things worse. Reinhardt has been watching you since you found that photograph. He knows everything. In the distance, Torres could hear the rumble of approaching vehicles, their headlights cutting through the darkness as they turned into the cemetery entrance. The black government sedans rolled through the cemetery gates like funeral processions, their engines barely audible in the cold night air. Their headlights swept across the rows of tombstones, casting dancing shadows that made the graveyard look like a scene from a nightmare. Torres counted at least 6 vehicles, each one carrying men who moved with the crisp efficiency of federal agents. Dr. Heinrich Reinhardt emerged from the lead car, a tall, thin man in his 60s, wearing a pristine military uniform adorned with insignia Torres didn't recognize. His face was sharp and angular, with pale grey eyes that seemed to catalogue everything they saw. Behind him came a squad of soldiers, but these were alive, their breath visible in the frigid air, their movements human and natural. Sergeant Torres, Reinhardt said, his voice carrying a slight German accent despite his American uniform, you have caused us considerable inconvenience tonight. Torres straightened to attention despite his fear, military training overriding his terror. Sir, I was investigating irregularities in personnel records. I had no knowledge of any classified programs. Reinhardt smiled, but it was the cold expression of a man who viewed people as laboratory specimens. Of course you didn't. But now you do, which presents us with a problem. Project Eternal Sentry is classified at levels that don't officially exist. The men standing around you are officially dead, buried with full military honors. Their families have grieved for them. The government has paid death benefits. Pete cowered behind a large marble monument, but the undead soldiers had formed a perimeter around the entire area. There was no escape. "What do you want from us?" Torres asked. "From the gravedigger? Nothing. He has served his purpose unknowingly for years, maintaining the cemetery, ensuring the graves appear properly tended." Reinhardt gestured dismissively toward Pete. "He will be returned to his home with no memory of tonight's events. A simple injection, quite painless." "And me?" Reinhardt's smile widened. "You, Sergeant, present a unique opportunity. Your military record is exemplary. No family, no close relationships, completely devoted to your service. You are exactly the type of candidate we seek for the program." Torres felt the blood drain from his face. "You want to kill me." "Kill you? No, Sergeant. We want to improve you, to make you into the perfect soldier. Imagine never feeling fear, never feeling pain, never questioning orders. Imagine serving your country for eternity." Morrison stepped closer to Torres, his pale eyes reflecting the car headlights. "Don't listen to him, Sergeant. I volunteered too, and I've regretted it every moment since. We're not soldiers anymore. We're weapons, tools to be used and discarded." "Silence, Morrison," Reinhardt snapped. "You forget your place. You exist at the pleasure of the United States government. We created you, and we can unmake you just as easily." "Can you?" Morrison challenged. "Then why haven't you stopped the malfunctions? Why are we appearing in photographs? Why are we remembering things we're not supposed to remember?" Reinhardt's confident expression flickered momentarily. "Minor technical difficulties. Nothing that can't be corrected with the proper adjustments." Torres noticed the exchange, filing it away. If Morrison was right, if the program was failing, then perhaps these creatures weren't as invincible as they seemed. "What happens if I refuse?" "You won't refuse," Reinhardt said matter-of-factly, "because the alternative is far less pleasant. You see, Sergeant, you already know too much. We cannot allow you to leave here with that knowledge. Your choices are simple. Join the program voluntarily and retain your consciousness and personality for several months before the inevitable decay sets in, or be terminated now and have your body conscripted into service anyway." The living soldiers raised their weapons, aiming at Torres and Pete. Their faces were grim but determined, the faces of men following orders they didn't particularly like but wouldn't question. "However," Reinhardt continued, "I am not without mercy. I will give you 1 hour to consider your decision. Think carefully about what you value more, your life as you know it, or your service to your country." Morrison moved closer to Torres, his voice dropping to a whisper. "There's something he's not telling you, something about why the program is failing. I've been watching, listening, trying to understand what's happening to us. The others, the older subjects, they're not just mindless. They're fighting back from the inside." "What do you mean?" "The serum doesn't just reanimate dead tissue. It traps the soul, keeps it bound to the body. But souls aren't meant to be caged, Sergeant. They're finding ways to resist, to break free. That's why we're appearing in photographs, why we're remembering. We're trying to tell the world what's been done to us." Reinhardt was conferring with his subordinates near the cars, their voices too low to overhear. Pete remained huddled behind the monument, occasionally whimpering softly. "Is there a way to stop this?" Torres asked. "To free the others?" Morrison was quiet for a long moment, staring at Kerner's corpse in the open grave. "Maybe. The original formula is hidden somewhere in Omaha. If we could find it, reverse engineer it, we might be able to break the bonds that keep us tethered. But it would mean destroying ourselves in the process." Torres glanced around the cemetery, calculating distances and possibilities. The living soldiers were well trained, but they were human, with human limitations. The undead ones were faster and stronger, but Morrison had suggested they might be unreliable. If he was going to act, it had to be soon. "Where would Kerner have hidden the formula?" Torres whispered to Morrison. "The old German district, down by the river. Before the war started, there was a community of German immigrants there. Kerner had contacts, safe houses. If he hid anything, it would be there." Torres nodded, then raised his voice. "Dr. Reinhardt, I need to see the body of the man I'm supposed to become. I want to understand what I'm agreeing to." Reinhardt looked up from his conference with interest. "A reasonable request, very well, but make it quick." Torres walked to the edge of Morrison's grave and knelt down, pretending to examine Kerner's corpse. Instead, he palmed a handful of the strange, warm earth that wouldn't hold snow. He had noticed that wherever this soil touched, the undead soldiers seemed to avoid stepping. It might mean nothing, or it might be important. "The transformation process is quite remarkable," Reinhardt said, approaching the grave. "The subject retains all memories and skills, but gains enhanced physical capabilities, strength, speed, endurance, immunity to most forms of damage, and the cost, gradually diminishing free will as the serum integrates with the nervous system. But truly, Sergeant, is free will such a precious thing? You're a soldier. You follow orders already. This simply makes those orders irresistible." Morrison caught Torres's eye and gave an almost imperceptible nod toward the cemetery gates. The undead soldier was preparing something, but Torres couldn't tell what. "I've made my decision," Torres announced, standing up. "I'll join your program, but on one condition." Reinhardt raised an eyebrow. "You are hardly in a position to negotiate conditions. Let the gravedigger go. Pete Kowalski has nothing to do with this. He's just an old man trying to do his job. If you're going to erase his memory anyway, why not do it at his home instead of here? Sentiment, Sergeant. How disappointingly human of you." But Reinhardt nodded to one of his men. "Very well. Escort Mr. Kowalski to his residence and administer the standard memory suppression protocol." Two soldiers moved toward Pete's hiding place, but as they did, Morrison suddenly straightened to his full height. His pale eyes began to glow with an inner light, and when he spoke, his voice carried an otherworldly resonance. "Brothers, remember who you were," he called out. "Remember your families, your lives, your freedom." The other undead soldiers stopped moving. For a moment, they stood perfectly still, and Torres could see something changing in their faces. The blank expressions flickered, replaced by confusion, then recognition, then overwhelming anguish. "What is happening?" Reinhardt demanded, pulling out a strange device that looked like a radio transmitter. "Return to formation. I'm giving you a direct order." But the undead soldiers were no longer listening. One of them, a man who might have been 30 when he died, dropped to his knees and began to weep. Another tore at his uniform, trying to remove the symbols of his unwilling servitude. The third began walking toward Reinhardt with murder in his newly awakened eyes. "Impossible," Reinhardt breathed, frantically adjusting dials on his control device. "The neural pathways should be completely suppressed by now." "You underestimated the human soul, Doctor," Morrison said. "It can be caged, but it cannot be broken. And when souls cry out in unison, even death cannot silence them." The living soldiers opened fire on the approaching undead, but the bullets passed harmlessly through their targets. The creatures that had once been men were beyond physical harm now, sustained by something more powerful than Reinhardt's serum. Torres used the chaos to his advantage, throwing the handful of cemetery earth directly into Reinhardt's face. The scientist screamed and staggered backward, clawing at his eyes. Where the soil touched his skin, it seemed to burn like acid. "Pete, run!" Torres shouted, then grabbed Morrison's arm. "We need to get out of here. Where's the safe house you mentioned?" Morrison pointed toward the river. 2 miles downstream, there's an old brewery with German writing on the walls. But Torres, you have to understand, once we start this, there's no going back. Finding that formula means facing things that were meant to stay buried. Then we'd better get moving before Reinhardt recovers. They ran through the cemetery, weaving between tombstones as gunfire erupted behind them. The other undead soldiers had turned on their creators, and Torres could hear screams echoing through the night air. Some of those screams sounded human, others decidedly did not. As they reached the cemetery gates, Torres looked back once. The scene was like something from Dante's vision of hell, shadows fighting shadows while living men ran in terror from enemies they couldn't kill or understand. "This is just the beginning," Morrison said as they disappeared into the dark streets of Omaha. "Reinhardt will call in more resources. Military units, federal agents, maybe even other test sites. We've just declared war on the United States government." The old German district of Omaha hugged the banks of the Missouri River like a forgotten memory, its narrow streets lined with brick buildings that had seen better days. Most of the German families had moved away or changed their names after America entered the war, leaving behind empty storefronts with faded signs in a language that was now viewed with suspicion. Torres and Morrison moved through the shadows, keeping to the alleys and side streets. Behind them, the city was coming alive with the sound of sirens and military vehicles. Searchlights swept across the sky, and Torres could see government cars racing through the downtown area. Reinhardt was mobilizing everything he had. "Here," Morrison said, stopping in front of a 3-story brick building with boarded-up windows. Above the entrance, carved into the stone lintel, were German words that Torres couldn't read. Körner used the basement of this brewery as his laboratory. If he hid the original formula anywhere, it would be here. The front door was secured with a heavy chain and padlock, but Morrison simply grasped the metal links and pulled. The chain snapped like paper, the supernatural strength in his undead frame making short work of the barrier. Inside, the brewery smelled of dust, mold, and something else, a chemical odor that reminded Torres unpleasantly of formaldehyde. Their footsteps echoed in the empty space as Morrison led him through a maze of abandoned equipment toward a staircase that descended into darkness. "Stay close," Morrison warned. Kerner was paranoid, even before the government captured him. He set traps throughout this place. The basement was a labyrinth of small rooms and narrow corridors, carved directly into the bedrock beneath the building. Morrison seemed to navigate by memory, leading Torres past chambers filled with strange equipment, glass tubes, electrical devices, and tables stained with substances Torres didn't want to identify. They found Kerner's laboratory in the deepest part of the basement, behind a door marked with German warnings and scientific symbols. The room beyond was a monument to obsessive research, its walls covered with charts, photographs, and equations written in multiple languages. Dozens of glass containers lined wooden shelves, filled with specimens floating in murky preservatives. "My God," Torres breathed, taking in the scope of the scientist's work. How long was he working on this? Years, even before he came to America. The German military was interested in his research too, but they thought he was too unstable, too dangerous, so he defected, thinking the Americans would be more receptive to his ideas. Torres examined the photographs on the walls. Many showed subjects in various stages of the reanimation process, their faces contorted in expressions of agony and horror. Others showed the successful subjects, standing at attention with the same blank expressions he had seen on the undead soldiers at the cemetery. "Here," Morrison said, opening a metal filing cabinet. "The original research notes. Everything Kerner learned, everything he discovered about the boundary between life and death." Torres took the thick folder Morrison handed him and began reading by the light of a kerosene lamp they had found. The documents were a mixture of English and German, filled with technical terminology and scientific diagrams, but gradually a horrifying picture emerged. Kerner hadn't just discovered a way to reanimate dead tissue, he had found a method to trap human souls at the moment of death, binding them to their corpses with a combination of chemicals and electrical stimulation. The process required the subject to die in a specific way, at a specific moment, while connected to Kerner's machinery. "The training accident," Torres said suddenly. "Morrison, you didn't die in an accident. They murdered you as part of the experiment." Morrison nodded grimly. "I volunteered, remember? They told me it was a new type of combat training, that I would be helping to develop techniques to save soldiers' lives. I didn't know until it was too late that the accident was planned down to the second." Torres continued reading, his horror growing with each page. The formula wasn't just a serum. It was a complete process that required the subject's soul to be artificially anchored to their body using a combination of rare chemicals and precisely timed electrical shocks. The binding was intended to be permanent, but Kerner's note suggested he had been working on a reversal process before his capture. "There," Torres said, pointing to a section written in Kerner's careful handwriting. "He calls it the Liberation Protocol, a way to sever the soul's connection to the reanimated body, allowing natural death to occur. What does it require?" Torres read further, his expression growing troubled. "The original binding site, the place where each subject died and was first reanimated. The reversal process has to be performed there, using a counter-agent derived from... oh hell. What? From the blood of someone who has touched the boundary between life and death but returned to the living. Someone who has had a near-death experience but survived." Morrison was quiet for a moment. "You mean someone like you, Sergeant? Someone who has been exposed to the reanimation process but not completed it?" Torres looked up from the documents. "What do you mean?" "That cemetery earth you threw at Reinhardt. It didn't burn him because it was holy ground. It burned him because it was saturated with the chemicals used in the reanimation process. And when you handled it, when you absorbed it through your skin, you became a bridge between the world of the living and the world of the undead." As if to confirm Morrison's words, Torres suddenly felt a strange tingling in his hands. Looking down, he saw that his fingertips were beginning to glow with the same pale light he had seen in Morrison's eyes. Above them, the sound of boots on the brewery floor announced that Reinhardt's men had found their hiding place. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the basement corridors as Reinhardt's men spread out to search the brewery. Torres could hear their voices, terse military commands as they systematically cleared each room. They had perhaps minutes before discovery. "Is there another way out?" Torres whispered, stuffing Kerner's research notes inside his coat. Morrison shook his head. "The basement connects to the old tunnel system that runs under this part of the city, but most of those passages have been sealed. There's only one exit I know of, and it leads directly to the river." "Then that's where we go." Morrison led him deeper into the laboratory complex, past chambers filled with increasingly disturbing equipment. In one room, Torres glimpsed what looked like electric chairs modified with strange attachments and monitoring devices. In another, glass tanks large enough to hold human bodies were connected to a complex system of pipes and electrical cables. "This is where they brought me," Morrison said, pausing at the entrance to a chamber dominated by a metal table surrounded by machinery. "This is where I died and was reborn as something else." Torres felt the tingling in his hands intensify as they entered the room. The air itself seemed charged with residual energy, and he could see faint traces of luminescence emanating from the equipment. His exposure to the cemetery soil was making him sensitive to the supernatural forces that permeated this place. "The footsteps are getting closer," Torres said. "We need to move." They found the tunnel entrance hidden behind a false wall in the deepest part of the basement. The passage beyond was narrow and flooded with several inches of freezing water that had seeped in from the river. Morrison moved through it easily, his undead body unaffected by the cold, but Torres had to fight against the numbness that crept up his legs as they waded through the darkness. Behind them they could hear Reinhardt's men discovering the laboratory. Shouts echoed through the tunnels as the soldiers found evidence of their presence. "Sir, they were definitely here. The research files are missing. Find them," came Reinhardt's voice, distorted by distance but still carrying clear authority. "They cannot be allowed to leave the city with that information." The tunnel seemed to stretch for miles, though Torres knew it couldn't be more than a few hundred yards to the river. The walls were slick with moisture, and strange growths that seemed to pulse with their own dim light. More than once Torres had to stop and steady himself as waves of dizziness washed over him. "The transformation is accelerating," Morrison observed, noticing Torres's distress. "Your exposure to the cemetery soil created a connection to our world. The longer you remain in places saturated with the reanimation energy, the stronger that connection becomes." "What does that mean?" "It means that even if we succeed in freeing the others, you may not survive the process. The boundary between life and death is becoming blurred for you, Sergeant. Soon you'll exist in both worlds and neither." They emerged from the tunnel onto a narrow strip of rocky beach beside the Missouri River. The water was black under the overcast sky, and chunks of ice floated past like ghostly ships. Across the river, the lights of Council Bluffs twinkled in the distance, but they might as well have been on another planet. "Now what?" Torres asked, pulling Kerner's notes from his coat and checking that they were still dry. "We need to get back to Fort Omaha," Morrison said. "According to those documents, the reversal process requires access to the original binding sites, the places where each subject was first killed and reanimated. For me, that was the firing range where they staged my accident. But the base will be crawling with Reinhardt's people by now." "Yes, but it's also the one place where we might find other subjects who are beginning to remember their humanity. If what happened at the cemetery can happen again, if we can awaken more of the undead soldiers, we might have a chance." Torres looked at his hands, which were now glowing brighter in the darkness. The light seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat, and he could feel something fundamental changing in his body. His reflection in the river water showed the same pale luminescence that marked Morrison's eyes. "How long do I have?" he asked. Morrison was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know. Kerner's notes suggest that someone in your condition might last a few hours, maybe a day. But Sergeant, there's something else you need to understand. The reversal process, the liberation protocol, it requires a sacrifice. The person who serves as the bridge between life and death doesn't survive the procedure." Torres absorbed this information without surprise. Somehow he had already known that this mission would be one way. The moment he had picked up that photograph, the moment he had chosen to investigate instead of reporting it through proper channels, he had sealed his fate. "Then we'd better make it count," he said. "How many subjects do you think are buried around the country?" "Dozens, maybe hundreds. Reinhardt has been perfecting the process for years, creating soldiers who can be deployed anywhere, anytime, without the need for traditional military support. The perfect covert operatives." A new sound reached them across the water. The rumble of boats approaching from upstream. Searchlights swept across the river surface, probing for any sign of their quarry. "They found the tunnel exit," Morrison said. We need to get moving." They began working their way along the riverbank, staying low and moving from cover to cover. But Torres could feel his strength ebbing as the transformation progressed. Each step required more effort, and his vision was beginning to blur at the edges. The journey back to Fort Omaha took them through the industrial heart of the city, past factories that worked around the clock to support the war effort. Steam rose from smokestacks like ghostly fingers, reaching toward the clouded sky, and the air was thick with the smell of coal smoke and metal. Torres found himself moving through this landscape like a man in a dream, his perception shifting between the world of the living and something else entirely. "There," Morrison said, pointing toward a cluster of warehouses near the rail yards. "We can cut through the freight area and approach the base from the east. The security there is lighter." As they moved through the shadows between the buildings, Torres began to see things that shouldn't have been there. Translucent figures in military uniforms walked among the living workers, invisible to everyone except him. Some were missing limbs, others bore wounds that had killed them long ago. All of them wore expressions of infinite sadness. "Morrison," Torres whispered, "I'm seeing dead soldiers everywhere. Dozens of them." Morrison followed his gaze and nodded grimly. "The city is full of them. Men who died in training accidents, equipment failures, mysterious illnesses. All of them subjects in Reinhardt's program, all of them buried in unmarked graves or shipped home in sealed coffins. Your transformation is allowing you to see them as they truly are." One of the ghostly figures approached them, a young man who couldn't have been more than 19 when he died. His uniform was from the early days of the program, and his chest bore the telltale mark of Kerner's reanimation process, a circular scar that glowed with the same pale light as Morrison's eyes. "Please," the figure said, his voice barely audible above the industrial noise. "Help us. We've been trapped for so long." "How many?" Torres asked. "All of us. Every man who died at Fort Omaha since 1937. We're all part of the program, whether we volunteered or not. They need fresh bodies for the experiments, so they arrange accidents, create illnesses, stage training incidents." Torres felt sick as the full scope of Reinhardt's operation became clear. This wasn't just about creating undead soldiers. It was about harvesting test subjects from the military's own ranks, turning American servicemen into guinea pigs for a mad scientist's obsession with conquering death. They reached the perimeter of Fort Omaha, just as dawn was breaking over the Nebraska horizon. The base was in full lockdown, with armed guards at every entrance and military vehicles patrolling the fence line. Searchlights swept the grounds continuously, and Torres could see snipers positioned on the rooftops of key buildings. "There's no way we're getting through that," Torres said, his voice growing weaker as the transformation progressed. His hands were now so bright they could be seen even in the growing daylight. "Yes, there is," Morrison replied. "Remember, I still have security clearance. Officially, I'm a soldier following orders, and you're my prisoner." Morrison's plan was audacious in its simplicity. He would march Torres through the main gate, claiming to have captured an enemy saboteur who had been attempting to steal classified documents. Once inside, they could make their way to the firing range where Morrison's transformation had taken place. "It might work," Torres admitted. "But what about the other guards? Won't they recognize you from the burial detail?" "Look at me, Sergeant. Really look at me. Do I look like the man they buried 3 years ago?" Torres studied Morrison's face and realized he was right. Death and reanimation had changed him in subtle but significant ways. His features were sharper, his skin paler, his movements more precise. He looked like Morrison's brother, perhaps, or a close relative, but not quite the same person. They approached the main gate as the morning shift change was taking place. Morrison adopted the rigid posture of a soldier on duty, while Torres allowed himself to slump forward as if exhausted and defeated. The documents from Kerner's laboratory were hidden inside his coat, their weight feeling like a lead burden against his chest. "Halt!" called the guard at the gate, raising his rifle. "State your name and business." "Sergeant Morrison, returning from special assignment," Morrison replied, in a voice that carried absolute military authority. "I have captured this saboteur attempting to steal classified materials from civilian facilities in the city." The guard studied Morrison's face with a puzzled expression. "You look familiar, Sergeant, but I can't quite place you. I was transferred here from Fort Riley last month, special assignment under Dr. Reinhardt's command. Perhaps you remember my brother, James Morrison. He was killed in a training accident here in 1939. Oh yes, that's it. You have a strong family resemblance. Sorry for your loss, Sergeant. Thank you. Now if you could process us quickly, Doctor. Reinhardt is waiting for my report." The guard waved them through, and Torres marveled at how easily Morrison had manipulated the situation. But as they walked across the base grounds, he noticed that other soldiers were beginning to stare. Some pointed and whispered among themselves, and Torres realized that Morrison's disguise wouldn't hold up under extended scrutiny. "The firing range is just ahead," Morrison said quietly, "but we have a problem. There are at least a dozen soldiers conducting training exercises there. We'll need a distraction." Torres looked at his glowing hands and made a decision that he knew might cost him his life. "I'll give you one. Get to the range and start the reversal process. I'll buy you as much time as I can. Sergeant, you don't understand. Without you there to serve as the conduit, the liberation protocol won't work. Then you'd better work fast." Torres walked deliberately toward the center of the base, his glowing hands held high above his head. The luminescence had grown so bright that it was visible even in the morning sunlight, casting an otherworldly radiance that made nearby soldiers stop and stare in bewilderment. "I am Staff Sergeant Michael Torres," he announced in a voice that carried across the parade grounds. "I have discovered evidence of illegal human experimentation being conducted at this facility. Dr. Heinrich Reinhardt has been murdering American soldiers and reanimating their corpses for military purposes." The reaction was immediate and chaotic. Soldiers ran toward him from every direction, their weapons drawn but their faces confused. They had been trained to handle enemy agents and saboteurs, but nothing in their experience had prepared them for a glowing man making accusations about undead soldiers. "Stand down, Sergeant Torres," came a familiar voice from behind him. He turned to see Reinhardt approaching with a squad of his special operatives, their black uniforms marking them as something other than regular military personnel. "Dr. Reinhardt," Torres called out, making sure his voice carried to every corner of the base. "Tell these men about Project Eternal Sentry. Tell them about James Morrison and the dozens of other soldiers you've murdered in the name of science." "Sergeant Torres is suffering from exposure to experimental chemicals," Reinhardt announced to the gathering crowd. "He requires immediate medical attention. All personnel are ordered to return to their duties immediately." But the soldiers weren't moving. They had seen the supernatural light emanating from Torres's body, had heard his accusations, and were beginning to ask questions of their own. More importantly, Torres could see other figures beginning to materialize around the base, the ghostly forms of dead soldiers that only he could perceive, but whose presence was somehow affecting the living. Near the motor pool, a mechanic suddenly stopped working and stared at empty space as if seeing something that shouldn't be there. By the communications building, a radio operator removed his headphones and walked outside, drawn by an invisible force. The dead were calling to the living, and the living were beginning to respond. Meanwhile, Morrison had reached the firing range and was working frantically to prepare the reversal process. The range looked exactly as it had 3 years ago, with the same targets, the same firing positions, the same patch of ground where he had fallen when Reinhardt's people had murdered him. Using Kerner's notes, Morrison began mixing the chemical compounds needed for the liberation protocol. The process was complex, requiring precise measurements and careful timing, but his undead nature allowed him to work with mechanical precision. As he worked, he could feel the other subjects responding to his presence, their souls stirring in their artificial prisons. Back on the parade grounds, Torres was facing increasing pressure from Reinhardt's operatives. They had formed a circle around him, their weapons trained on his glowing form, but they seemed reluctant to open fire in front of so many witnesses. "You're making a mistake, Sergeant," Reinhardt said, his voice carrying a tone of false compassion. "The chemicals you've been exposed to are affecting your judgment. Submit to treatment now and you can be saved." "Saved?" Torres laughed bitterly. "Like you saved Morrison. Like you saved all the others." He pulled Kerner's research documents from his coat and held them high. The papers seemed to catch fire in the supernatural light emanating from his hands, but instead of being consumed, they began to glow with the same radiance. "These documents detail every aspect of your program," Torres shouted. "Every murder, every experiment, every violation of human dignity you've committed in the name of national security." The gathered soldiers were growing agitated. Some had begun to recognize names mentioned in Torres's accusations, friends and comrades who had died in suspicious circumstances over the past few years. The mood was shifting from confusion to anger, and Reinhardt's control over the situation was slipping. At the firing range, Morrison completed the final preparations for the liberation protocol. The chemical mixture was ready, the electromagnetic field generators were positioned correctly, and the reversal process could begin. But he needed Torres present, to serve as the conduit between the living and the dead. Morrison could see the disturbance on the parade grounds from his position, could see Torres surrounded by hostile forces. Time was running out for both of them. Making a decision that would have been impossible when he was truly alive, Morrison began the reversal process on himself. The chemicals burned as they entered his system, and the electromagnetic fields sent waves of agony through his reanimated body. But more importantly, they began to break down the artificial bonds that kept his soul tethered to his corpse. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Across the base, other undead subjects began to manifest visibly, their forms becoming solid and real as the network of control that bound them started to collapse. Dead soldiers materialized in the barracks, the mess hall, the administrative buildings, their presence causing panic among the living personnel. Torres felt the change as well. The connection between himself and the supernatural realm intensified, and suddenly he could see not just the dead soldiers, but the entire web of corruption that Reinhardt had woven throughout the military. He could see which officers were complicit, which accidents had been staged, which deaths had been murders disguised as training incidents. "It's time," Torres announced, his voice now carrying power that seemed to come from beyond the grave. Time for the truth to be revealed. The base erupted into chaos as the undead soldiers materialized throughout Fort Omaha. In the mess hall, Private Danny Kowalski, Pete's nephew who had died in a kitchen fire 18 months earlier, appeared at his old station, still wearing his cook's apron, but with the telltale glow of reanimation in his eyes. In the barracks, Corporal William Hayes sat up in his former bunk, the bullet wound that had supposedly been self-inflicted clearly visible in his forehead. But these weren't the mindless automatons that Reinhardt had created. Morrison's sacrifice had awakened something in them, restored their humanity even as it revealed their true nature. They spoke with their own voices, remembered their own names, and most importantly, they remembered how they had died. "Murder," whispered Private Rodriguez as he appeared in the motor pool where he had been crushed by a accidentally released jack. "They murdered all of us." The living soldiers on the base found themselves face to face with friends and comrades they had mourned, men whose funerals they had attended, whose belongings they had packed and shipped home to grieving families. The psychological impact was devastating. Grown men wept openly as they recognized the faces of the dead. Reinhardt's operatives tried to maintain control, but they were vastly outnumbered and completely unprepared for this scenario. Their training had covered enemy infiltration, sabotage, and conventional threats, but nothing had prepared them for dealing with their own victims returning to bear witness against them. "All personnel, return to your quarters immediately," Reinhardt commanded through the base's public address system. "This is a chemical weapon attack designed to cause hallucinations. Do not trust what you are seeing." But his words carried no authority now. Too many soldiers were seeing too much truth for his lies to hold. Colonel Matthews, the base commander who had been kept in the dark about Project Eternal Sentry, emerged from his office to find his aide, a young lieutenant who had died in a jeep accident 6 months earlier, standing at attention beside his desk. "Sir," the ghostly lieutenant said, "I need to report a crime. Several crimes, actually." Torres could feel his own transformation reaching its climax. The boundary between life and death was dissolving around him, and he could see the threads of supernatural energy that connected every soul on the base. Morrison's reversal process was working, but it was spreading beyond just the undead soldiers. The entire network of Reinhardt's control was unraveling. At the firing range, Morrison was dying for the second time, but this death was different from the first. Instead of the agony and terror he had experienced when Reinhardt's people murdered him, he felt a sense of peace, of completion. The artificial bonds that had held his soul captive were breaking, and he could feel himself preparing for the journey that death should have allowed him years ago. "Thank you," he whispered to Torres across the distance that separated them. "Thank you for setting us free." Reinhardt made one final, desperate attempt to salvage his project. Drawing a pistol from his coat, he aimed it at Torres's glowing form. "If I can't control you, I'll destroy you," he snarled. "All of you." But before he could fire, the ghostly soldiers began to converge on him. They moved through the living personnel like mist, but when they reached Reinhardt, they became solid and real. Hands that had been murdered by his orders now reached for him. Voices that had been silenced by his experiments now spoke his condemnation. "We remember," they said in unison, their voices creating a chorus that seemed to come from beyond the grave. "We remember everything." Reinhardt's weapon fell from nerveless fingers as the weight of his crimes manifested physically around him. The dead soldiers didn't harm him, they didn't need to. Simply being confronted with the full scope of his evil, seeing the faces of every man he had killed, was punishment enough. His mind snapped under the pressure, and he collapsed to his knees, babbling incoherently about scientific progress and national security. Torres felt the final stage of his transformation beginning. His body was becoming translucent, caught between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. But unlike Morrison and the others, he wasn't heading toward peace. His role as the bridge between worlds meant that he would exist in neither, serving as an eternal guardian to prevent others from suffering Reinhardt's fate. Colonel Matthews had taken control of the situation with the efficiency of a career military officer. Reinhardt and his operatives were under arrest. The base was secured, and calls had been placed to Washington to report the discovery of an illegal human experimentation program. The truth would come out, Torres realized. The families of the murdered soldiers would finally learn what had really happened to their sons. As the undead soldiers began to fade from view, released at last from their artificial prison, they turned to Torres with expressions of gratitude. They were free to continue their interrupted journey to whatever lay beyond life, but they wanted him to know that his sacrifice had not been in vain. "The others," Morrison said, as his form grew increasingly transparent. "The subjects at other bases, other facilities, you'll need to find them, help them as you helped us." Torres nodded, understanding that his transformation was not an ending, but a beginning. He would exist as a guardian spirit, seeking out other victims of programs like Eternal Sentry, ensuring that the dead could find their rest and the living could learn the truth. As the sun reached its zenith over Fort Omaha, the last of the undead soldiers faded into peaceful oblivion, their souls finally free to continue the journey that death should have granted them years earlier. 1 year later, Pete Kowalski stood at the edge of Prospect Hill Cemetery, watching as a team of government officials supervised the proper reburial of James Morrison and the other victims of Project Eternal Sentry. The old gravedigger's memory of that terrible night had been restored after Reinhardt's arrest, and he had become one of the key witnesses in the congressional investigation that followed. The scandal had rocked the military establishment to its core. Dozens of officials were court-martialed, entire programs were shut down, and new oversight procedures were established to prevent such horrors from ever occurring again. The families of the murdered soldiers received official apologies and substantial compensation, though no amount of money could truly heal the wounds that had been inflicted. Reinhardt himself had been declared mentally incompetent and confined to a secure psychiatric facility, where he spent his days scribbling equations that made no sense and muttering about the boundary between life and death. His operatives had been sentenced to long prison terms, and his research had been declared classified at the highest levels to prevent its misuse by future madmen. But Pete knew that the real victory belonged to Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, whose sacrifice had made all of this possible. The official reports listed Torres as missing in action, presumed dead while investigating enemy sabotage activities. His name was engraved on the memorial wall at Fort Omaha, and he had been posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for his heroism. The truth, however, was more complex. Pete had seen Torres several times over the past year, always at twilight, always in places where the boundary between the living and the dead was thin. The former sergeant appeared as a translucent figure, glowing with the same pale light that had marked his final transformation, watching over the cemetery and the city beyond. Torres had become something unprecedented, a guardian spirit born from the intersection of science and the supernatural, dedicated to protecting others from the kind of horrors that Reinhardt had inflicted. Pete had heard rumors from other cities, stories of mysterious figures appearing at military bases where suspicious deaths had occurred, helping to expose cover-ups and ensure justice for the victims. On this particular evening, as the last of the reburial ceremonies concluded and the government officials departed, Pete was not surprised to see Torres materialize among the freshly marked graves. The spirit looked exactly as he had in life, except for the ethereal glow that surrounded him and the infinite sadness in his eyes. "It's finished," Pete said quietly, knowing that Torres could hear him even if others could not. "They're all properly buried now, with their real names on the headstones. Their families know the truth." Torres nodded, his gaze moving across the rows of graves where Morrison and his fellow victims now rested in peace. "Thank you, Pete, for taking care of them, for remembering their stories. What about you? Will you ever find peace?" Torres was quiet for a long moment, considering the question. "I don't think so. There are others out there, Pete. Other programs. other victims. As long as men like Reinhardt exist, as long as power corrupts people into thinking they can play God with human lives, someone needs to stand watch. That's a heavy burden to carry. It is, but it's also an honor. These men died serving their country, even if their country betrayed them. They deserve to have someone remember them, someone who will ensure their sacrifices weren't in vain. As the last light of day faded from the Nebraska sky, Torres began to fade as well, becoming one with the shadows that gathered between the tombstones. But before he disappeared completely, he turned back to Pete with something that might have been a smile. "Take care of yourself, old friend, and if you ever see anything that doesn't belong, anything that suggests the dead aren't being allowed their rest, you know how to reach me." Pete nodded, understanding that Torres would always be watching, always ready to answer the call when injustice threatened the boundary between life and death. The old gravedigger made his way home through the quiet streets of Omaha, knowing that the city and the nation was safer because of the vigilant spirit that now guarded it. In the years that followed, there would be other investigations, other scandals exposed, other victims given the justice they deserved, and always, in the shadows of these revelations, witnesses would report seeing a glowing figure in military uniform, ensuring that the truth could not be buried along with the dead. The war against those who would exploit the sanctity of death continued, but now the dead had a champion who would never tire, never falter, and never allow their sacrifices to be forgotten. Staff Sergeant Michael Torres had found his eternal duty, and he would serve it faithfully until the end of time itself. Some soldiers, it seemed, were indeed meant to serve beyond the grave, not as weapons in the hands of madmen, but as guardians of justice for those who could no longer speak for themselves. And in the quiet moments between dusk and dawn, when the veil between worlds grew thin, they could still be seen walking their posts, eternal sentinels ensuring that the dead would never be dishonored again.